The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson sat alone in the armory. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, disassembling his rifle with the kind of muscle memory that comes from 2 decades of military service. The metal components clicked softly as he laid them out on the worn wooden table, each piece finding its designated spot in a ritual he had performed thousands of times before. Marcus was not like the other soldiers on base. While his fellow servicemen gathered in the mess hall for breakfast, sharing stories and complaints about their upcoming deployment, he preferred the solitude of the early morning hours. There was something peaceful about the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of boots marching in formation outside. It gave him time to think, to remember, and to prepare his mind for what lay ahead. At 42 years old, Marcus had seen more combat than most soldiers twice his age. His face bore the subtle marks of someone who had spent years in the desert sun of Afghanistan and the humid jungles of various classified locations around the world. His dark eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences he would never fully share with anyone, not even his wife Sarah, who waited for him back home in North Carolina with their 2 teenage children. The rifle before him was more than just a weapon. It was his lifeline, his constant companion through firefights and midnight raids, through moments of terror and instances of incredible bravery that would never make it into any official reports. Every scratch on its surface told a story. Every worn edge spoke of survival against impossible odds. As he began cleaning the barrel with methodical strokes, Marcus allowed his mind to wander back to the beginning of his military career. He had enlisted at 18, fresh out of high school, with dreams of adventure and a desire to serve his country. Back then, he thought he understood what courage meant. He believed that heroes were the loud ones, the soldiers who charged into battle with war cries and dramatic gestures. 24 years later, he knew better. Real courage was quiet. It was the medic who crawled through enemy fire to reach a wounded comrade. It was the radio operator who stayed at his post even when the building was collapsing around him. It was the soldier who made the hard choices when no one was watching, when there were no cameras or reporters to document the moment. Marcus had learned this lesson the hard way during his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. His unit had been tasked with securing a small village that intelligence suggested was being used as a staging area for insurgent attacks. What they found instead was a community of families trying to survive in the crossfire of a war they never asked to be part of. The village elder, a man named Hamid who spoke broken English, had approached Marcus during their first night there. The old man's weathered hands shook as he described the terror his people lived with every day. The insurgents would come at night, demanding food and shelter, threatening to kill anyone who cooperated with American forces. During the day, coalition troops would arrive, searching for signs of enemy activity, sometimes detaining innocent villagers based on unreliable intelligence. Marcus had seen this scenario played out dozens of times before, but something about Hamid's quiet dignity struck him differently. Perhaps it was the way the old man never asked for anything for himself, only for the safety of his grandchildren. Perhaps it was the small photograph he carried of his son, killed in a bombing 2 years earlier while working as a translator for American forces. That night, as Marcus cleaned his rifle by the light of a small camp lantern, he made a decision that would change the course of his military career. Instead of following standard protocol and moving on to the next objective, he chose to stay. He convinced his commanding officer that the village held strategic value, that establishing a permanent presence there would disrupt enemy supply lines. What Marcus didn't tell his CO was that he had already begun working with Hamid to identify the real threats in the area. The old man had a network of contacts throughout the region, people who had grown tired of living in fear. Together, they developed a system of communication that allowed the villagers to provide information about insurgent movements without putting themselves at risk. Over the next 6 months, Marcus's unit successfully disrupted 3 major attacks and captured 2 high-value targets. The official reports credited improved intelligence gathering and enhanced security measures. They never mentioned the quiet conversations between an American soldier and an Afghan elder, or the trust that had been built one careful interaction at a time. The success in that village had caught the attention of higher command. Marcus found himself recommended for advanced training, specialized assignments, and, eventually, selection for elite units. His superiors saw in him the qualities they valued most: tactical intelligence, emotional control under pressure, and the ability to build relationships with local populations. But Marcus knew the truth. His effectiveness didn't come from any special training or natural talent. It came from understanding that real strength often looked like weakness to those who didn't know better. It came from knowing when to listen instead of speak, when to show restraint instead of force. Now, as he reassembled his rifle in the quiet armory, Marcus thought about the mission that lay ahead. Delta Force had called him up for a classified operation, something that required his particular set of skills. The briefing had been vague, but he understood enough to know that lives would depend on his ability to make the right choices in impossible circumstances. The rifle clicked into place, fully assembled and ready for action. Marcus held it up to the light, checking the alignment of the sights, testing the smooth action of the bolt. Everything was perfect, as it always was. He had never been careless with his weapons, never cut corners when it came to maintenance. Too many good soldiers had died because of equipment failures that could have been prevented with proper care. As he stood to return the rifle to its case, something made him pause. On the wall of the armory hung dozens of photographs of soldiers who had served with distinction, some living, others who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their faces looked down at him with expressions of determination, hope, and quiet resolve. Marcus thought about the photograph he carried in his own breast pocket, not of fallen comrades, but of his daughter Emma at her high school graduation. She had chosen to study international relations, inspired by his stories about helping people in faraway places. She wanted to make a difference in the world, to build bridges instead of walls. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, preparing for another mission that would likely involve violence and destruction, while his daughter dreamed of a world where such missions weren't necessary. Sometimes he wondered if he was part of the problem or part of the solution. A knock on the armory door interrupted his thoughts. Captain Rodriguez entered, carrying a folder marked with red security classifications. "Thompson, we need to talk," the captain said, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by something more serious. "Delta wants you wheels up in 6 hours. This one's different." Marcus nodded, securing his rifle in its case. "Different how, sir?" Rodriguez hesitated, glancing around the empty armory before speaking in a lower voice. "They specifically requested you. Not just any experienced operator. You, by name." This was unusual. Delta Force typically worked with a pool of pre-screened personnel, selecting team members based on mission requirements rather than personal preferences. For them to request a specific soldier suggested either a very specialized need or very specialized knowledge. "Do we know what the mission parameters are?" Marcus asked. "Need to know basis. And, apparently, we don't need to know," Rodriguez replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What I can tell you is that it's not a direct action mission. No raids, no high-value target captures. They need someone who can blend in, build trust, gather intelligence." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Those were exactly the kind of missions he had been hoping to avoid. Not because they were dangerous, though they certainly were, but because they required him to become someone else entirely. To lie convincingly, to manipulate relationships, to use people's trust against them. "I understand, sir," he said, because that's what was expected. As Captain Rodriguez left, Marcus remained alone with his thoughts and his rifle. He opened the case one more time, not to check the weapon's condition, but to look at something else entirely. Engraved on the stock, in letters so small they were barely visible, were 3 words that no one else had ever noticed. Those words contained a story that could change everything, a truth that even Delta Force didn't know they were about to discover. Marcus closed the case and headed for the door. In a few hours, he would board a transport plane to an undisclosed location, where he would meet the elite soldiers who had requested him specifically. They would expect to find a seasoned operator, someone who could handle any assignment with professional detachment. Instead, they would find a man carrying a secret that would challenge everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and the true cost of serving one's country. They would find a soldier whose greatest victory had never been recorded in any official report, whose most important mission had been completed not with bullets and explosives, but with patience and understanding. The morning sun had risen higher now, and the base was fully awake. Soldiers hurried past the armory windows, preparing for another day of training and routine duties. None of them knew that in a few hours, one of their own would disappear into the shadowy world of special operations, carrying with him a weapon that bore witness to a truth more powerful than any ammunition it had ever fired. Marcus walked toward his quarters to pack his gear, his rifle case in one hand and his future in the other. He thought about Hamid, the village elder who had taught him the most important lesson of his military career. Real strength wasn't about overpowering your enemies. It was about understanding them, finding common ground, and, sometimes, choosing not to fight at all. The words engraved on his rifle served as a constant reminder of that lesson, a promise he had made to himself and to the people whose lives had been entrusted to his care. Soon, very soon, Delta Force would read those words and understand that they had called upon not just a soldier, but a guardian of something much more valuable than tactical objectives. As he disappeared into the maze of military buildings, Marcus Thompson carried with him a secret that would redefine what it meant to be a warrior in the modern age. The transport plane's engines hummed steadily as it cut through the night sky, carrying Marcus Thompson toward a destination that existed on no public maps. He sat among 12 other passengers, all special operations personnel, but none spoke during the 4-hour flight. The red lighting in the cabin cast everything in an otherworldly glow, and the only sounds were the mechanical whispers of the aircraft and the occasional rustle of someone adjusting their gear. Marcus kept his rifle case secured between his boots, one hand resting protectively on its handle. The other passengers carried similar cases, but theirs contained standard-issue weapons configured for specific mission types. His was different, though none of them knew it yet. The engraving hidden beneath layers of military tape and standard markings told a story that would soon reshape everything Delta Force thought they understood about their new team member. When the plane finally touched down, they were met by a convoy of unmarked vehicles that transported them through a series of security checkpoints to a facility that officially didn't exist. The buildings were modern but unremarkable, designed to blend into the surrounding landscape while hiding the sophisticated technology and elite personnel within. Colonel James Mitchell was waiting for them in the briefing room, a man whose reputation preceded him even in the secretive world of special operations. Mitchell had commanded successful missions on every continent, earned more commendations than most soldiers could count, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people. When he looked at Marcus, those calculating eyes seemed to pierce right through to his soul. "Gentlemen," Mitchell began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You're here because each of you possesses skills that our current situation requires. This mission will test not just your tactical abilities, but your capacity for patience, discretion, and cultural sensitivity." He activated a large display screen that showed satellite imagery of a mountainous region Marcus immediately recognized as somewhere in Central Asia, though the specific location remained classified. Red markers indicated various points of interest, while blue lines traced possible infiltration routes. "Our target is not a person or a facility," Mitchell continued. "It's information. Intelligence suggests that a network of tribal leaders in this region has been coordinating resistance activities against hostile forces. These aren't insurgents or terrorists. They're local people trying to protect their communities from outside threats." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of situation he had encountered in Afghanistan, the delicate balance between military objectives and humanitarian concerns. He watched as Mitchell highlighted several villages scattered throughout the mountainous terrain, each one a potential source of crucial intelligence or a deadly trap for unprepared soldiers. "The challenge," Mitchell said, meeting each man's eyes in turn, "is that these tribal leaders have been betrayed before. They've lost family members, seen their villages destroyed, because they trusted the wrong people. They won't talk to us using conventional approaches." Another screen activated, showing profiles of the team members. Marcus saw his own photograph and service record, though he noticed that certain details had been redacted. His time in Afghanistan was mentioned, but the specific nature of his work with local villages was classified at a level apparently too high for this briefing. "Each of you has been selected for specific reasons," Mitchell explained. "Williams, your language skills and cultural training make you our primary liaison. Henderson, your technical expertise will be crucial for communications and surveillance. Thompson. Mitchell paused when he reached Marcus's profile, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Thompson, you're here because of your track record working with local populations. Command believes you have a unique ability to build trust in hostile environments. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but internally, he was processing something troubling about Mitchell's tone. There was a subtext there, a suggestion that his selection for this mission was based on more than just his official record. Someone had done deeper research into his background, possibly uncovering details that were supposed to remain buried. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering insertion methods, communication protocols, and contingency plans. The mission parameters were unlike anything Marcus had encountered in his special operations career. Instead of a timeline measured in days or weeks, they were looking at potentially months of careful relationship building. Instead of overwhelming firepower, they would rely on small arms and personal weapons only. Questions? Mitchell asked as the briefing concluded. Sergeant Henderson raised his hand. Sir, what's the acceptable loss threshold for this mission? If we're discovered or compromised, what are our extraction options? Mitchell's answer was characteristically direct. There are no acceptable losses on this mission, Henderson. These people have suffered enough. If we can't complete our objectives without causing additional harm to the local population, then we abort and find another way. This surprised several team members, including Marcus. Military operations typically involved calculated risks and acceptable casualty rates. To hear a colonel explicitly prioritize civilian welfare over mission completion was almost unprecedented. After the formal briefing ended, Mitchell approached Marcus privately. Thompson, I need a word. They walked to a smaller conference room where Mitchell closed the door and activated privacy measures that would prevent electronic surveillance. When they were alone, the colonel's demeanor became noticeably more serious. I'm going to be direct with you, Mitchell said, settling into a chair across from Marcus. We know about the village in Afghanistan. Not the official version in your service record, but what really happened there. Marcus felt his blood turn cold, but he maintained his composure. Sir, I'm not sure what you mean. Mitchell smiled grimly. The official report says your unit successfully disrupted enemy operations through enhanced intelligence gathering. What it doesn't say is that you prevented what would have been a massacre. Intelligence had marked that village for a major operation based on faulty information. 300 civilians would have died. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning. Marcus had never told anyone the complete truth about that deployment, not even his wife. How Mitchell had obtained this information was a mystery, but the implications were clear. How you convinced command to delay the operation, how you personally verified that the intelligence was wrong, how you risked your career to save those lives, Mitchell continued. That's why you're really here, Thompson. Not because you can shoot straight or follow orders, but because you can think for yourself when lives are at stake. Marcus realized that this conversation was either the beginning of a promotion opportunity or a court-martial proceeding. Sir, I was following my best assessment of the tactical situation. You were following your conscience, Mitchell corrected him. And that's exactly what this mission needs. The tribal leaders we need to reach aren't going to trust another soldier following orders. They need to meet someone who understands that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that never make it into the history books. Mitchell stood and walked to a secure cabinet, from which he withdrew a classified folder. Inside were photographs and documents that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. They were pictures from the Afghan village, showing the faces of people he had worked so hard to protect. Hamid, the village elder, was prominently featured, along with several other locals who had provided crucial intelligence. Hamid survived, Mitchell said, noticing Marcus's reaction to the photographs. So did his grandchildren. The village still exists, and the people there still remember the American soldier who chose to listen instead of shoot. Marcus stared at a photograph of children playing in the village square, the same children he had seen hiding in basements during firefights. Knowing they were safe, that they had grown up and were living normal lives, filled him with an emotion he couldn't name. This mission is similar, Mitchell explained. But the stakes are higher. The tribal leaders we need to reach have information about a threat that could destabilize the entire region. Traditional military approaches have failed because they're dealing with people who have been traumatized by decades of conflict. He handed Marcus another folder. this one containing intelligence reports and cultural assessments. The tribal network they needed to infiltrate had been approached multiple times by various military and intelligence agencies. Each attempt had failed because the outsiders were perceived as just another group trying to exploit local resources or manipulate tribal politics for foreign interests. "What makes you think I can succeed where others have failed?" Marcus asked. Mitchell's answer was simple but profound. "Because you're not going there to take something from them. You're going there to give them something they haven't had in a long time, a reason to trust again." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Lieutenant Williams entered with a concerned expression. "Sir, we have a problem with the equipment manifest. Thompson's rifle isn't standard configuration." Mitchell looked puzzled. "Explain." Williams glanced uncertainly at Marcus before continuing. "His weapon has non-regulation markings. Engraving on the stock. Protocol requires all personal modifications to be documented and approved." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The engraving on his rifle was something he had hoped to keep private, at least until he decided how much to reveal about his past. Now it seemed that decision was being made for him. "Show me," Mitchell ordered. They moved to the equipment bay, where Marcus's rifle case sat among the others. Under the bright fluorescent lights, Williams demonstrated how the standard military tape had partially worn away, revealing glimpses of carved letters beneath. "Remove the tape," Mitchell instructed. Marcus hesitated for just a moment before complying. He peeled away the layers of protective tape, exposing the engraving he had carried secretly for years. The words were carved in small, precise letters, never forgotten. The room fell silent as the three men stared at the simple inscription. To most people, it would seem like a generic memorial phrase, the kind of thing soldiers often had engraved on personal weapons. But Mitchell was not most people. "When did you have this done?" he asked quietly. "After Afghanistan," Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "After the village." Mitchell studied the engraving more closely, then looked up at Marcus with an expression of growing understanding. "This isn't about fallen comrades, is it?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "It's about the people we're supposed to protect. The ones whose names never appear in any reports, whose faces we're supposed to forget when the mission ends." Williams looked confused, but Mitchell understood immediately. This wasn't just a rifle with sentimental engraving. It was a physical reminder of a promise, a commitment to something larger than military objectives or national interests. "The village elder," Mitchell said. "Hamid, you promised him something." "I promised him that his people wouldn't become statistics," Marcus replied. "That someone would remember they were human beings, not just sources of intelligence or acceptable casualties." Mitchell nodded slowly, as if pieces of a complex puzzle were finally falling into place. "And you've carried that promise with you ever since?" "Yes, sir." The colonel was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what he had learned. Marcus waited, unsure whether he had just ended his military career or taken it in an entirely new direction. Finally, Mitchell spoke. "Lieutenant Williams, this conversation is classified. Nothing about this engraving appears in any official report." "Understood, sir," Williams replied, though he still looked confused about what exactly he was keeping secret. After Williams left, Mitchell turned back to Marcus. "The tribal leaders we need to reach, they've all lost people they loved to this conflict. They need to know that someone remembers, that someone cares about more than just military objectives." He gestured toward the rifle with its exposed engraving. "This is why you're really here, Thompson. Not because you're a good soldier, but because you're a good man who happens to be a soldier." Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For years, he had wondered if his promise to Hamid and the people of that Afghan village made him weak, if his inability to forget their faces was a liability in a profession that required emotional detachment. Now, for the first time, someone was telling him that his greatest perceived weakness was actually his greatest strength. "The mission begins tomorrow," Mitchell said. "Get some rest. And Thompson, keep that engraving visible. Where we're going, the people we need to meet will understand exactly what those words mean." As Marcus walked back to his quarters, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a teenage recruit with dreams of heroic service, to a seasoned operator carrying the weight of promises made to people whose names he would never forget. Tomorrow, he would enter another conflict zone, another situation where lives hung in the balance. But this time, He wouldn't have to hide who he was or what he believed. This time, his conscience and his duty were finally aligned. The rifle case felt lighter in his hands as he prepared for whatever lay ahead. 3 weeks into the mission, Marcus Thompson found himself sitting cross-legged in a circle of weathered stones, sharing tea with men whose faces told stories of survival that spanned generations. The mountain village of Kardaria existed in a fold between two peaks, hidden from satellite surveillance, and accessible only by treacherous paths known to local guides. The air was thin at this altitude, and every breath reminded Marcus that he was farther from civilization than he had ever been. The village elder, a man called Kadir, poured tea from a brass pot that had been in his family for over a century. His hands were steady despite his advanced age, and his eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from making life-or-death decisions for an entire community. Around the circle sat 6 other men, each representing different clans within the tribal confederation that controlled this region of the mountains. Marcus had spent weeks earning the right to sit in this circle. The approach had required patience he didn't know he possessed, and cultural sensitivity that went far beyond anything taught in military training. Colonel Mitchell's intelligence had been accurate. These people had been betrayed so many times by outsiders that they trusted no one who arrived with promises and modern weapons. The breakthrough had come when Marcus made a decision that violated every protocol in the Special Operations Handbook. He had arrived at the village alone, having left his teammates at a staging area 2 days' walk away. Even more significantly, he had left his rifle behind, carrying only a sidearm and the small personal items that told the real story of who he was. Among those items was a photograph of the Afghan village where he had learned the most important lesson of his military career. When Kadir had asked him why he carried pictures of foreign children, Marcus had told the truth. He explained about Hamid, the village elder who had trusted an American soldier enough to help prevent a massacre. He spoke about the promise he had made to remember the human cost of conflict, regardless of political objectives. But it was the story behind his rifle's engraving that had finally convinced these mountain people to trust him. When Marcus explained how those 2 words, never forgotten, represented his commitment to honoring the lives of innocent people caught in conflicts they never chose, something had shifted in the village dynamics. These were people who understood the weight of memory, who carried their own losses like physical burdens. Now, 3 weeks later, the trust was finally beginning to pay dividends. The Tribal Confederation had agreed to share intelligence about a threat that had been growing in the region for months. What they described was more serious than anything in the official briefings Marcus had received. The men who come from the south, Kadir said, his voice carefully modulated in the way of someone accustomed to discussing dangerous topics. They are not like the others. They bring machines we do not understand, and they speak of things that frighten even our bravest fighters. Through the careful translation provided by Ahmad, one of the younger tribal members who had learned English from aid workers, Marcus began to understand the scope of what they were facing. The hostile force that had been infiltrating this region wasn't just another insurgent group or foreign military unit. They were something entirely different, equipped with technology and resources that suggested state-level backing. They came first to the village of Sang Masha, explained another elder named Rostam. They said they were doctors, here to help with the sickness that had killed the children. But after they left, more children died, and some who lived began to act strangely. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Biological weapons were among the most feared threats in the modern intelligence community, and the symptoms being described suggested someone was conducting field tests on civilian populations. What kind of strange behavior? He asked carefully. Ahmad translated the question, and several of the elders exchanged meaningful looks before responding. The children who survived began to forget things, Rostam said through the translator. Important things. The faces of their families. The names of their animals. Some could no longer speak their own language properly. The implications were terrifying. Marcus was listening to a description of what sounded like deliberately induced neurological damage, possibly the result of experimental weapons designed to disrupt cognitive function. If a hostile force was testing such weapons on isolated mountain villages, the international ramifications could be catastrophic. How many villages have been affected? Marcus asked. The answer that came back, translated carefully by Ahmad, was worse than he had feared. 7 villages across the region had been visited by the mysterious medical teams. In each case, the pattern was the same. Initial offers of help, followed by unexplained illnesses and cognitive symptoms in children and elderly residents. "We sent messengers to the government in the capital," Kadir said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They told us we were imagining things, that mountain people are prone to superstition. But we are not foolish. We know the difference between sickness and poison." Marcus understood why official channels had failed. Remote tribal communities often had their concerns dismissed by central governments, especially when those concerns involved accusations against foreign entities. The political complexities of investigating such claims in an already unstable region made official action unlikely. But Marcus also understood something the bureaucrats in distant capitals didn't. These people weren't primitive or superstitious. They were intelligent, observant, and deeply connected to their environment. If they said something unnatural was happening to their children, someone needed to listen. "Would you be willing to show me one of these affected villages?" Marcus asked. The question sparked a heated discussion among the elders, conducted in rapid-fire Dari that Ahmad didn't bother translating. Marcus could sense the tension in the circle as the men debated the risks of involving an outsider in their community's most sensitive crisis. Finally, Kadir spoke directly to Ahmad, who turned to Marcus with a serious expression. "They want to know about your rifle," Ahmad said. "Rostam says you carry words on your weapon. They want to know what those words mean." Marcus had been expecting this question. During his time in the village, several people had noticed the unusual engraving on his rifle stock, but politeness had prevented them from asking directly. Now, faced with a request for help that could put their entire community at risk, they needed to understand exactly who they were trusting. "The words say never forgotten," Marcus replied. "They remind me that every person we meet in this kind of work is someone's child, someone's parent, someone whose life matters." Ahmad translated, and Marcus watched the faces around the circle as his words were processed. These were men who had lost family members to decades of conflict, who had seen their communities devastated by forces beyond their control. The idea that a foreign soldier would carry a permanent reminder of such losses was almost unprecedented. "Kadir wants to know if you have children," Ahmad said. "Two. A daughter and a son, both teenagers. And if someone poisoned your children, what would you do?" Marcus didn't need translation to understand the weight of that question. "I would do whatever it took to protect them and to make sure it never happened to anyone else's children." The circle fell silent as Kadir considered this response. When he finally spoke again, his words carried the authority of someone making a decision that would affect countless lives. "Tomorrow, you will come with us to Sang Masha," Ahmad translated. "But you must understand, if what we show you brings soldiers to our mountains, if sharing this information causes more harm to our people, we will consider you our enemy." Marcus nodded his acceptance of these terms. He understood that he was being offered an extraordinary opportunity, but also that he was accepting a profound responsibility. These people were trusting him not just with intelligence that could be tactically valuable, but with the safety of their families and their way of life. That evening, as Marcus prepared his gear for the journey to the affected village, he thought carefully about how to proceed. Standard protocol would require him to immediately report the intelligence he had gathered and request a larger investigative team. But he had learned enough about the cultural dynamics of the region to know that such an approach would likely backfire. Instead, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable earlier in his career. He contacted his team via encrypted communications and instructed them to maintain their current positions while he conducted additional reconnaissance. He didn't specify the nature of that reconnaissance or mention the potential biological weapons threat. Marcus knew he was violating protocols and potentially putting his military career at risk. But he also knew that rushing the process could result in the loss of invaluable intelligence and, more importantly, could endanger the very people he was trying to protect. The next morning, Marcus found himself walking along a narrow mountain path beside Rostam and 2 younger tribal members who would serve as guides. The journey to Sang Masha would take most of the day, following ancient routes that wound through valleys and overpasses known only to local people. As they walked, Rostam shared more details about the mysterious medical teams. The strangers had arrived in vehicles that were too new and well-maintained for the region. They carried equipment that seemed more sophisticated than anything typically used for basic medical care. Most tellingly, they had shown no interest in treating any of the common ailments that plagued mountain communities. They only wanted to see the children and the grandparents, Rostam explained through one of the guides who spoke some English. They said the young adults were too strong, that their medicine wouldn't work on healthy people. This detail sent another chill down Marcus's spine. Biological weapons testing often focused on vulnerable populations precisely because their immune systems were less able to resist novel pathogens. The fact that the mysterious medical teams had specifically targeted the most vulnerable members of each community strongly suggested deliberate experimentation. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking the village of Sangmasha. What Marcus saw below him looked like any other mountain settlement. Stone houses with flat roofs, small terraced fields carved into the hillsides, livestock grazing on sparse vegetation. But, as they descended toward the village, he began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong. There were no children playing in the streets. The few people visible moved slowly, without the purposeful energy typical of mountain communities. When they reached the village center, Marcus observed something that made his blood run cold. Several elderly residents sitting in doorways with the vacant expressions of people whose minds were no longer fully their own. Rostam led them to a house where they were met by a woman named Bibi Gul, whose grandson had been among those affected by the mysterious illness. Through halting translation, she described how her 8-year-old grandson had been a bright, curious child before the medical team's visit. Now, 6 weeks later, he struggled to remember simple words and often forgot the names of his own family members. When Bibi Gul brought her grandson to meet them, Marcus had to fight to maintain his composure. The boy's eyes held a confusion that was heartbreaking to witness. When his grandmother spoke to him in Dari, he responded in fragmented sentences that mixed his native language with words that seemed to come from nowhere. The doctors gave him injections, Bibi Gul explained through the translator. They said it would make him strong, protect him from diseases. But, after they left, he became sick. And, when the sickness passed, he was different. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon documenting what he observed in Sangmasha. Using his military training in intelligence gathering, he systematically recorded symptoms, timelines, and patterns that could provide crucial evidence if his suspicions about biological weapons testing proved correct. But, beyond the tactical intelligence he was gathering, Marcus found himself deeply affected by the human tragedy he was witnessing. These were innocent people, living in one of the most remote places on Earth, who had been victimized by forces they couldn't understand or resist. Their trust in outsiders offering help had been exploited in the most cruel way imaginable. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Marcus realized that this mission had become something entirely different from what he had expected. He wasn't just gathering intelligence anymore. He was bearing witness to what might be a war crime, and accepting responsibility for ensuring that justice was served. That night, camping in the mountains between Sangmasha and Kardaria, Marcus cleaned his rifle by the light of a small fire. As he worked, he traced the engraving with his finger, never forgotten. The words had taken on new meaning in the past few days. They were no longer just a reminder of promises made to people in a distant war. They had become a commitment to the children of Sangmasha, to Bibi Gul and her damaged grandson, to all the innocent people who had been sacrificed to someone's experimental ambitions. Tomorrow, he would return to Kardaria and begin the delicate process of turning intelligence into action. But, tonight, he was simply a soldier sitting by a fire in the mountains, holding a weapon that carried the weight of promises he intended to keep. The stars above the Hindu Kush shone with a clarity impossible in the modern world below. In their light, Marcus Thompson made a new promise to himself and to the people who had trusted him with their darkest secret. Whatever it took, however much it cost him personally, he would make sure that the voices of these mountain people were heard by those who had the power to stop the atrocities being committed in their villages. The engraving on his rifle gleamed in the firelight, 2 simple words that contained a universe of meaning. Never forgotten. It was both a memorial and a battle cry, a reminder of the past, and a commitment to the future. The Delta Force Command Center had never seen anything quite like the evidence Marcus Thompson presented when he finally returned from the mountains. For 6 hours, he sat in a sterile briefing room, methodically laying out photographs, translated testimonies, and carefully documented observations that painted a picture of systematic human experimentation in remote tribal villages. Colonel Mitchell listened in growing horror as Marcus described what he had witnessed in Sang Masha and the other affected settlements. The clinical precision with which the mysterious medical teams had targeted vulnerable populations suggested not just criminal intent, but sophisticated knowledge of biological warfare techniques. The cognitive damage appears to be progressive, Marcus explained, pointing to medical notes he had compiled with the help of village elders. Children who were exposed 6 months ago are worse now than those who encountered the teams more recently. Whatever was administered to them seems to cause cumulative neurological deterioration. Major Sarah Chun, Delta Force's intelligence analyst, studied the photographs Marcus had taken of affected villagers. Her expression grew more troubled with each image. These symptoms are consistent with exposure to experimental psychotropic compounds, she said grimly. The kind of research that was supposedly banned by international treaties decades ago. But it was the identity of the perpetrators that truly shocked the room into silence. Through careful questioning of village witnesses and analysis of equipment left behind, Marcus had uncovered evidence pointing to a joint operation between rogue elements of a hostile nation's military and a private pharmaceutical corporation with contracts throughout the region. They're using isolated populations as test subjects, Marcus concluded. The remoteness provides security, the poverty ensures silence, and the lack of medical infrastructure means symptoms can be attributed to natural causes. The briefing room fell quiet except for the hum of air conditioning. Everyone present understood the implications. They were looking at evidence of war crimes being committed against defenseless civilians, conducted by actors with resources and connections that reached into multiple governments. Colonel Mitchell was the first to speak. Thompson, the intelligence you've gathered here could expose a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of international politics. Are you prepared for the consequences of pursuing this? Marcus thought about Bibi Gul's grandson, about the vacant eyes of the elderly residents of Sang Masha, about all the children who might suffer if this information remained buried in classified files. With respect, sir, I'm more concerned about the consequences of not pursuing it. Mitchell nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. But you need to understand, taking this intelligence up the chain means we're declaring war on some very powerful people. The kind of people who have the resources to make problems disappear, including the people trying to solve them. Over the next week, Marcus found himself at the center of a complex intelligence operation unlike anything in his experience. Working with international law enforcement agencies and covert operatives from allied nations, Delta Force began building a case that could expose the biological weapons testing program and bring its architects to justice. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the situation became. The pharmaceutical corporation involved had contracts with major governments and connections to influential politicians. The rogue military elements were protected by layers of bureaucracy and plausible deniability. Even approaching the wrong person with questions could trigger a cover-up that would bury the evidence forever. Marcus found himself in the unprecedented position of being both a special operations soldier and a key witness in what was becoming an international investigation. His detailed documentation from the mountain villages provided crucial evidence, but it also made him a target for anyone who wanted to keep the biological weapons program secret. The turning point came when Marcus was summoned to a meeting that officially never took place, in a location that didn't exist on any map. He found himself sitting across from people whose faces he couldn't see clearly, and whose names he would never know, but whose authority was unmistakable. Sergeant Thompson, said a woman whose voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected nations. What you've uncovered has implications that reach far beyond the villages where you gathered this intelligence. We need to know. Can you prove what you've told us? Marcus placed his rifle case on the table between them. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the secure facility, he once again removed the tape that had hidden his weapon's engraving from casual observation. This rifle has been with me for 8 years, he said quietly. It's been present at every critical moment of my career, every decision that mattered. The engraving on the stock represents a promise I made to innocent people who trusted me with their lives. He opened a folder containing photographs from both his time in Afghanistan and his recent mission to the mountain villages. These faces, Marcus continued, gesturing to the images, they represent everyone who has been forgotten by the people making decisions in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. The village elder who risked his life to prevent a massacre. The grandmother whose grandson can no longer remember her name. They trusted me because they believed I would keep my promise to remember them. Marcus looked directly at the shadowy figures around the table. You want proof? The proof is in my willingness to end my career, to risk my life, to challenge people far more powerful than I am, because forgetting these people would make me complicit in their suffering. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, the woman who had first spoken leaned forward into the light, revealing a face that Marcus recognized from news broadcasts. She was someone whose decisions could redirect the foreign policy of major nations. Sergeant Thompson, what if I told you that exposing this biological weapons program could destabilize an already fragile region? That bringing these criminals to justice might require diplomatic negotiations that could take years, during which more innocent people might suffer? Marcus thought about this carefully before responding. Ma'am, with respect, I would say that's the same argument people have used for decades to justify ignoring atrocities. At some point, someone has to be willing to say that protecting innocent people is more important than political convenience. Another voice from the shadows spoke up. And if pursuing justice for these village children means putting other operations at risk, other lives that depend on maintaining certain political relationships, then we find a way to protect everyone, Marcus replied. Because if we start deciding which innocent lives matter more than others, we lose the moral authority to call ourselves the good guys. The meeting continued for hours, with Marcus facing questions that tested not just his knowledge of the evidence he had gathered, but his commitment to seeing justice done regardless of the personal cost. By the time it ended, he understood that his life as a soldier was effectively over. He would never again be just another operator following orders. He had become something more dangerous to certain powerful interests, a witness with a conscience. 3 months later, Marcus found himself testifying before an international tribunal that had been convened in secret to address the biological weapons program. His testimony, combined with evidence gathered by investigators from multiple countries, resulted in the arrest of 12 individuals and the exposure of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate leadership. The pharmaceutical corporation involved saw its executives imprisoned and its assets frozen. The rogue military elements were court-martialed and sentenced to life imprisonment. Most importantly, the biological weapons program was shut down, and medical teams were dispatched to the affected villages to provide real treatment for the victims. But Marcus's greatest satisfaction came from a different source entirely. 6 months after his testimony, he received a letter delivered through intelligence channels. It was from Ahmad, the young translator from Kar Daria, writing to inform him that Bibi Gul's grandson was beginning to recover his memory. The experimental treatments developed to counteract the biological weapons had been successful in reversing much of the cognitive damage. The boy remembers his grandmother's name now. Ahmad had written in careful English. And he remembers the American soldier who promised that his suffering would not be forgotten. Marcus read the letter while sitting in his new office at the Department of Veterans Affairs, where he had been assigned after leaving active duty. His role now involved helping other veterans transition to civilian life, but it also included a classified position as a consultant on international humanitarian issues. His rifle hung in a place of honor on his office wall, the engraving clearly visible to anyone who visited. Those 2 words, never forgotten, had become his personal mission statement, a reminder that the most important victories often happened far from public view and were measured not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in lives saved and promises kept. On the anniversary of his testimony before the International Tribunal, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Mitchell, now promoted to general, came to his office carrying a folder that contained photographs from the mountain villages he had investigated. I thought you should see these, Mitchell said, spreading the images across Marcus's desk. The photographs showed children playing in the streets of Sang Masha, elderly residents working in their gardens, and families gathered for evening meals. The vacant expressions and confused behaviors that had characterized the affected villages were gone, replaced by the normal activities of a healthy community. The medical teams report that recovery rates have exceeded all expectations, Mitchell explained. Whatever those bastards used for their experiments, the countermeasures we developed have been remarkably effective. Marcus studied each photograph carefully, recognizing faces he had seen during his darkest moments in the mountains. But now these faces showed hope instead of despair, understanding instead of confusion. There's something else, Mitchell continued. The intelligence you gathered didn't just stop one biological weapons program. It led us to 3 others in different parts of the world. Your willingness to trust those tribal leaders probably saved thousands of lives. As Mitchell prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at the rifle mounted on Marcus's wall. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I first read your service record, I thought those words on your rifle were about honoring fallen soldiers. I never imagined they were about something much more important. After Mitchell left, Marcus sat alone in his office, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a young recruit with dreams of heroic service to a middle-aged veteran whose greatest contribution had been learning to listen instead of shoot. He thought about Hamid, the Afghan village elder who had first taught him that real strength often looked like weakness. He thought about Kadir and Rostam, the mountain people who had trusted him with their darkest secret. He thought about Bibi Gul and her grandson, whose recovery had validated every risk he had taken. Outside his office window, the sun was setting over the Virginia landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, children were playing safely in villages where the nightmare of biological experimentation had finally ended. Marcus Thompson picked up his pen and began writing his daily report, documenting the progress of veterans under his care. It was quiet work, unglamorous work, the kind of service that would never make headlines or earn military decorations. But it was work that honored the promise engraved on his rifle, work that ensured the sacrifices of others would never be forgotten. And, in the end, Marcus had learned, that was the only kind of victory that really mattered. The rifle on his wall caught the last rays of sunlight, and, for a moment, the engraved words seemed to glow with their own inner light. Never forgotten, not just a promise, but a way of life, a commitment to remembering that behind every military operation, every intelligence report, every strategic decision, there were real people whose lives hung in the balance. Marcus had spent 24 years learning to be a soldier, but it had taken him a lifetime to understand what it truly meant to be a guardian of the innocent.